Lesson 3.6, Bias. Our objective for this lesson is to be able to identify potential sources of bias in a statistical study. Let's start by defining 5 types of bias, starting with selection bias. Selection bias occurs whenever researchers select their sample in a way that would tend to make it unrepresentative of the population. In the past few lessons, we've talked about ways to choose a sample so that it is representative of the population. And if we don't do that, then we end up with this selection bias. So for example, if we wanted to know what percentage of high school students have a job after school, but then we selected our sample by just walking into an Algebra 1 class and asking everyone in there whether or not they had a job after school, then that wouldn't be a representative sample because most of the people in an Algebra 1 class are going to be freshmen, and they're less likely to have a job after school than juniors and seniors. So that would be an example of selection bias. Another type of bias in the sample is participation bias. So participation bias occurs whenever people choose whether to participate. For example, you've seen on the back of trucks, you've seen the sign that says, "How am I driving? Call this number." Well, the only people that are going to call that number are people that have been cut off or have seen this truck driving erratically. You're not going to get people calling up and saying, yeah, he's doing great. So you want to avoid that type of bias in a statistical study where the only people who are choosing to participate are those that are particularly motivated to have their opinions heard. Next is funding bias. So funding bias occurs when the results of a scientific study tend to support the financial sponsor of the research. So for example, if we wanted to know what cell phone company has the clearest calls, but Verizon is paying for the research, it's going to be very difficult for the researchers to completely ignore the fact that one of the companies in their study is paying the bills. And so that's where you get that funding bias. It may not be overt, but maybe unconsciously they're making some decisions that might tend to favor the people that are funding their research. Next is recall bias. So recall bias occurs when participants do not remember previous events or experiences accurately or omit details. So for example, you might describe a class that you just had differently than a class that you're remembering from a year ago, because you might just remember the good things or you might just remember the bad things about that class. And so recall is not always going to be perfect, and we tend to kind of rewrite the details of things over time. Finally, survivorship bias. So survivorship bias occurs when the researcher focuses only on that part of the data set that already went through some pre-selection process. So for example, I go to the gym and I look around and I see nothing but people who are fit and dedicated and working hard. And I think, man, why is it that the whole world is more dedicated than me to physical fitness? But the thing is, I'm not seeing the whole world. I'm just seeing those people who have made it to the gym. I'm not seeing the hundreds of people who are sitting at home paying for a gym membership that they never use. So that missing information that we're seeing there is that we're not seeing, it results in this survivorship bias. A classic example of survivorship bias occurred during World War II. The military was trying to decide where to put armor on their planes. They didn't want to put armor everywhere. That would make the plane too slow. So they did a survey of all the planes as they came back from missions and noted everywhere that they saw a bullet hole. And they did notice that there were some parts of the plane where there were more bullet holes than others. And it was those parts of the plane that they wanted to put armor on. It was a mathematician named Abraham Wald who said, no, don't put armor where you see bullet holes. You want to put the armor where you don't see bullet holes. And his reasoning was this. From a probability standpoint, there's no reason that any square inch of a plane would be less likely to be hit than any other square inch of the plane. So if the bullet holes aren't everywhere on the plane, we must be missing some information. And Wald realized that that missing information was on the planes that didn't make it back from their missions. The places where we saw bullet holes were the places where a plane could get hit and still make it back safely to their base. The places where we didn't see bullet holes, for example, we saw a lot fewer bullet holes in the engines. Those were places where if a plane got hit, it wasn't likely to make it back. So it's that missing information that makes survivorship bias problematic. Our example says, on the singing competition TV series American Idol, whether a contestant advanced in the competition was determined by the television audience. For a 2-hour period after the episode ended, viewers could call or send a text message to their preferred contestant's telephone number, and each call or text message registered as a vote for that contestant. What potential sources of bias exist in this method of voting? So first, I should point out that American Idol is not intended to be a scientific survey. It's for entertainment purposes. But if we were trying to scientifically determine the greatest singer, there's a few potential sources of bias in this method of voting. First would be selection bias. We're not asking the entire population. We're just asking the people who are watching this show. And so there's some selection bias there, because the people who watch American Idol are probably not a representative sample of the entire population of the United States. Second is participation bias. So participation bias arises when someone has to voluntarily decide to participate in a study. And here we see that only those people who are particularly motivated, particularly passionate about a certain contestant are going to be calling in and voting, and doing so multiple times potentially over the 2-hour period that the phone lines were open. And so there's some participation bias there. The third type of bias that I see potentially is recall bias. Because the phone lines were only open at the end of the show, people may remember different performances differently based on the order in which the contestants sang. You may only remember the good parts of a performance that happened early on in the episode, or you might not remember that person well at all and only remember those that sang at the end of the episode. So that would be recall bias. So I would see selection bias, participation bias, and recall bias potentially skewing the results of this survey.